This video summary will briefly cover Chapter 13 on the spinal cord and spinal nerves. As you read through the chapter and write your own set of notes, you're going to find that the chapter in the book is huge because it has all the tables listing every nerve in the body. We're going to scale it down quite a bit. You're going to be reading through the anatomy of the spinal cord, and you're going to be figuring out both a frontal longitudinal view and a transverse cross-sectional view. Now you're going to figure out the spinal cord itself with the gray matter and the white matter. You're going to take a look at the three meninges, the pia mater, the arachnoid, and the dura mater, the three spaces between the meninges, the subarachnoid, subdural, epidural spaces, what fluids or materials are contained in each one of those spaces. From a longitudinal view, you can see the same spinal cord. It's going to be traveling all the way from the base of the skull down to the coccyx bone. We have the spinal cord travel down to where it ends at this point here. That end is called the conus medullaris. That's the inferior end of the spinal cord. Surrounding that are the three meninges we mentioned, pia mater, arachnoid, dura mater. They will form a connective tissue strap that anchors the spinal cord to the coccygeal bone, and that's called the cauda equina. You'll see there's two bulges in the spinal cord, the cervical enlargement and the lumbar enlargement. Those are going to represent nerves entering and leaving the spinal cord for the upper limb cervical enlargement, for the lower limb lumbar enlargement. Think of it as analogous to flying over the interstate. You can see where it's only bulges because of all the on-ramps and off-ramps as you get into a major city. That's where you're seeing here is that bulge of all the nerves traveling in and out. The spinal roots traveling all the way down the length of the spinal cord itself are going to travel out at each level of the spinal cord in between each one of the vertebrae. And so you'll have a series of cervical spinal roots coming out, and then you'll have thoracics and lumbars and sacral and finally coccygeal. Now these will bundle into nerve plexuses, and a plexus is a network of spinal roots, and there's four pair of plexuses. You're going to be studying the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. You'll figure out which spinal roots make up each, and you'd have, as I said, a pair of each, so on either side. So you'll figure out which spinal roots make up each plexus and what part of the body those sensory and motor neurons fill. Now, when we take a look at a spinal nerve itself, so when these roots all come together and come out to form the nerves of your body, the spinal nerve is going to be covered by connective tissue. And so an entire nerve is covered by a sleeve of connective tissue called the epineurium. And check your textbook to make sure you spell it correctly. Inside that epineurium are bundles of neurons called fascicles, and each fascicle is surrounded by a second layer of connective tissue called the perineurium. Inside of that are the individual neurons, and each of those are surrounded by endoneurium. So think of it as analogous to a power cord on an extension cord. The outer sleeve is the epi. Break that open would be three fascicles, each surrounded by a peri. Inside each wire is sleeved by endoneurium. Now, this is not the same thing as myelin sheath. That's different. That'd be inside each endoneurium. The job of the endoneurium, perineurium, epineurium is to provide flexible protection of the nerve, so as you move around, these long cells don't get broken. It also provides electrical isolation between each neuron, so all that sodium, potassium moving in and out during a depolarization doesn't fire from one neuron to another. So make sure you can identify all the parts of a spinal nerve. Now, you're also going to take a look at a reflex arc. And a reflex arc is at the level of each one of those spinal roots. And so I made the cross section of our spinal cord. I have the posterior root going in, containing the sensory neurons, and the anterior root traveling out, carrying the motor neurons. A reflex arc has 5 cells. And you're going to read about the sensory receptor, the afferent neuron, the interneuron, the efferent neuron, and the effector. Be able to describe what each one of those, the function of each one of those. Be able to describe for me the posterior root ganglia, what that represents. And then the book talks about 4 individual reflexes. It talks about things like the flexor withdrawal reflex. It talks about the stretch reflex, the tendon reflex. Be able to tell me how they differ and how a reflex arc works. Finally, I want you to review the terminology in this chapter and make sure that you understand when we use the correct terminology. So when you're looking at a bundle of neurons together, all piled together, whether in the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system, an entire bundle of neuron processes, axons and dendrites, in the peripheral nervous system is called a nerve. So when we talk about the ulnar nerve traveling along the posterior surface of my forearm, that is a bundle of neuron processes, axons and dendrites. In the central nervous system, spinal cord and brain, that would be called a tract. So if you talk about the spinal thalamic tract, which we'll describe later this semester, that's a tract, that's a group of neuron processes running between the spine and the thalamus up in the brain. We'll deal with that. A group of nerve cell bodies, like you saw in our little bundle right there, in the peripheral nervous system is called a ganglia, and so you'll learn about the posterior root ganglia. In the central nervous system, that group is called a nucleus. And so up in the brain, we'll learn about several nuclei, and that's a group of nerve cell bodies. That's where a lot of the integration and processing occurs. So, those are the big topics. You're going to be studying. Rewrite your notes several times. The chapter is huge, so you want to have your own notes to study so you don't spend a lot of time studying stuff that is not of significance to you. This is a rapid lecture, but you can rewatch this to your heart's content. Good luck.